First of all, I'd just like to welcome everybody and good afternoon. We're happy to have you in today's broadcast of the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center Science and Management webinar series. It's a partnership with the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Conservation Training Center. I'm Emily Fort, the Data and Information Coordinator at the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center. And on the phone we have Dave from the National Conservation Training Center, who will be facilitating the phone questions at the end of the conversation. So today's broadcast will be presented by Jeffrey Kirshner and Stephen Hostetler, and will be focused on the potential influence of a changing climate on Rocky Mountain native salmonids. I'll introduce our speakers in just a few minutes, but first I just wanted to give you a few logistical details. First, to those of us joining us by phone, all of the phones are currently on a global mute and will continue to be so throughout the duration of the presentation. After the completion of the presentation, we'll open the conference up for questions, and we'll have instructions on how to unmute yourself. So first, now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jeffrey Kirshner is currently the Director of the USGS Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center in Bozeman, Montana. He's also an Associate Professor at Montana State University. For most of his career, Jeff has worked on issues related to the effects of land management practices on aquatic and riparian resources. He currently oversees a research group of biologists and ecologists that address natural resource issues including global climate change, fire ecology, fish and wildlife ecology, and the conservation of endangered species. Stephen Hostetler is a research hydrologist at the USGS National Research Program in Corvallis, Oregon. He's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Geosciences and the College of Oceanic and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. His current work involves modeling past, present, and future climate and quantifying interactions and feedback of climate systems with terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our two esteemed speakers. I know we're all looking forward to hearing from them. So Jeff and Steve, please take it away.
I don't think I've ever been called esteemed in my life. I've been called a lot of things, never esteemed. So the introduction of this project was, see if we can get things to move here.
So we're having a minor technical issue with the presentation not advancing. Give us just 1 sec. All right.
Let's do it.
I think I just clicked on I think it just wasn't active.
Okay. Got it. Move the cursor.
Okay, it's looking good at this end. I think everyone can see the second slide.
Great. Well, it's my privilege today, and I know Steve's as well, that we get to present work that is really a collaborative partnership between a whole bunch of people that involve the USGS and different disciplines within USGS, as well as U.S. Forest Service and Trout Unlimited, Colorado State University, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. These folks that are up here on the board were all key players in this project, and in fact, I'm going to present which is mainly their work. So I thank them for letting me at least get this done. We had some remarks about the underwater photos that are part of the slide presentation, and these are taken by Johnny Armstrong, who's a PhD student at the University of Washington, and will complete his PhD, defends in the 6th of December, so we wish him luck. So a lot of people ask us why we started with trout. And one of the things that this group is really passionate about is that we all care about trout. And it's not just us that care about trout, but the public in general cares about trout. If you go all over the world, trout are found everywhere except for Antarctica. We could argue a little bit about whether they're supposed to be everywhere, but we won't do that in this presentation. Somebody asked Harrison Ford one time why he cared about trout, and he said, well, they live in all the best places. So, and there's probably enough said about that, but it's really true. Trout are typically found in mountainous habitats, nice, clean water. But then the great thing about trout is that generally, from the standpoint of climate change, they're thermally intolerant to rapid changes in stream temperature. So they're a good bellwether when things start to change from the standpoint of air temperature, water temperature changes. And they're generally viewed as early indicators of climate change. So it's something that if we We can take a look at trout, take a look at their habitat. You know, we have a pretty good indication that things may be changing quickly because they're typically associated in the West anyway with mountain ecosystems, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the other thing is that the existing threats to trout that have to do with habitat degradation and water withdrawals, things that are currently threats that sort of are playing a role in the life histories of trout, are potentially exacerbated or accelerated by the addition of climate stressors. So what are the concerns that we're dealing with? Trout express a variety of life history strategies. The terms up there, fluvial, adfluvial, and resident, refer to trout that are fluvial, essentially go back and forth between large river systems and smaller tributary streams. Adfluvial fish are fish that typically connect with lake systems and live in part with river systems in part of their life history. We're also concerned about issues of isolation. In other words, what's happened to trout worldwide, in particular native trout in the western U.S., is that they have been isolated in headwater drainages by water withdrawals, by the introduction of non-native species. And so there are real issues with trout from the standpoint of how they connect up with their habitats all over the West. And of course, we talked a little bit about habitat loss from a number of factors, including overgrazing, logging, mining, lots of bad actors there. And then the issue of non-native species invading trout habitat is a key one. And we'll talk a little bit about how climate is sort of related to this issue of non-native species. So one of the things when we first started this project back in 2007 that we were interested in knowing is what are the things that really influence trout from the standpoint of climate. And we had an initial project that started in 2008 that was sort of a 30,000-foot view of how trout are affected by climate change. And these are some of the things that we looked at in this first project. We looked at this idea of the trends to warmer winter, spring, reduced snowpack, and earlier snowmelt is probably an issue. It really does affect sort of how much water is available during the year for trout if we have less snowpack and our base flows occur earlier in the season. Same thing with the altered runoff regimes up there. Again, trout like the cutthroat trout that we study in this project are typically the descending limb spawners. That means that they spawn as flows go down with snowmelt runoff. And when that occurs earlier, then potentially they interact with other species that, like rainbow trout, that are ascending limb spawners. Potentially there's more interaction there from the standpoint of invasive species, and this interaction is not always positive. So the other part to this is that many of you have seen throughout the West is this idea that we're seeing more and larger wildfires. That was really apparent if you were anywhere in the West this year. We had smoke starting in early June, and it lasted all the way to September when we had our first snows. So we were under the gun with wildfires all season long. And then the last thing is this idea that we're seeing warmer summer temperatures. In this graph in the bottom right, you can look at records that were set in places like Wyoming and Colorado this year, and all over the West it was warmer than normal. And this has resulted in warmer water temperatures for us and a lot of things that have some pretty strong implications for trout and long-term survival. So this project that we did in 2008, essentially we looked at populations of trout west-wide, like I said, at the 30,000-foot level, used some of the criteria that we presented just in this previous slide, and said, well, what is our risk west-wide for trout as far as climate goes? And this composite graph that you see up here is essentially looking at green being low risk for populations, this yellow color being moderate, high, and very high. And you'll see the picture isn't a very pretty one. But again, this was a publication that came out as an open file report in 2010, and it has more of the details in there. In fact, a lot of the work that you'll see here is referenced by publications, and there are publications essentially either out or coming out within the next 2 months for all of this work. So there's a lot of data and there's a lot of analysis here. So we use this to say, all right, well, if we've got this kind of composite risk, how do we sort of focus north-south, starting at the Canadian border and going south, and looking at sort of a finer scale analysis of what's really going on out there?
What's inside the blue line? Is that like forest, natural forest?
Those are actually the ranges of the individual trout subspecies.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I should have said that before. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute or two, and I'll describe those. At the same time, as actually going on just a little bit later, some of our group were working in what was called the Western Trout Assessment. And this was led by Seth Wenger, who's a postdoc with Trout Unlimited, and worked with a number of us on this project. And what Seth did is say, all right, if we looked at the current models, climate models, what could we predict from the standpoint of habitat for all these different species across the West? And the unfortunate part about this analysis is that the best data that we have actually is on non-native species in the West, and that's for brook trout, rainbow trout, and brown trout. We do have some data on cutthroat trout, but what we actually saw was that given what we saw with the current models, if we started looking at 2040 and 2080, the picture's not very good for salmonids in general across the West. So cutthroat trout predicted reduction in 2080 was 57%, and for the other species, significant reductions as well. One of the interesting things about the brook trout and cutthroat trout dynamic in these watersheds in the West is that brook trout are non-native, but this issue of changing hydrographs actually sort of favors cutthroat more than it does brook trout, because brook trout are fall spawners. And so when there's less water and we get rain on snow events, the prediction is that brook trout are not going to do as well because their eggs are going to be in the gravel when we have these winter floods. So sort of an interesting sidelight from this manuscript. But again, this was out in Proceedings of the National Academy in 2011. So I wanted to show you sort of where we located our fine scale analysis, and what we wanted to do was to sort of take a north-south gradient approach in the analysis itself. So we wanted to look at systems to the far north, which included the Flathead River Basin that crosses the Canadian border and into Montana. Then we had the Yellowstone cutthroat trout in Yellowstone, Wyoming, and parts of Idaho. What you see to the far left in Idaho there is the Boise River Basin. Going down from the Yellowstone into Colorado is the Colorado River cutthroat trout. And then finally, the small dot there in Colorado and a little bit in Mexico is the Rio Grande cutthroat trout. And those are our fine scale analysis species. So the task we had in this particular project were that we needed to compile and produce these climate data sets that were going to help us understand sort of what's going on with climate. We wanted to develop hydrologic, thermal, and geomorphic models to downscale the climate models to look at stream habitats, develop some models from a biological standpoint that help us predict what's going to happen to the trout populations, assess the potential effects of climate change on stream habitats and trout species, and then look at some decision support tools to help us integrate some of these changes and give managers some options, and tell you how we accomplish some of that. I'm going to let Steve talk a little bit about the climate modeling part of this.
Okay, so part of this, as Jeff just said, part of this project, the expectation was for us to do a series of climate simulations with a regional climate model, dynamical downscaling, however you want to name it, over the West. And so we did that, and these are just the domains we used to do it. We had 4 domains in the east, 4 domains in the west, and 1 in the east. This is topography shown on the domains. So you can see that they're very high resolution. They capture the relief pretty well. And so the things that kind of are important to force climate in the West are pretty well resolved topographically. We did a series of simulations with 4 different climate models. We used GCMs to force these. The simulations are historic, so 1968 to 1999. And then several of them run from 2010 to 2099. So we have very long integrations over multiple decades for a lot of these simulations, so that we can look at not only climate change, but changes in variability, abrupt changes, things that we'd like to mine the data set for, Also, it gives us a very long time series to work with in terms of some of the other models that we've done. We start our data in 3 to 6 hour time steps and then averaged it up to daily and monthly averages for this project and in general on our website. We have a website, regclim at coasoregonstate.edu. In that website now we have the ability to visualize the data, the ability to download the data. We have teaching examples that allow people of different interests and different levels of expertise to step through how you actually use climate data, some of the pitfalls, the pluses and minuses, et cetera. And we have a open file report that came out is kind of the data release for all this. We have a number of collaborations, 3 projects under this funding. We've worked with CETA, the Center for Integrated Data Analysis in Wisconsin, USGS facility that now is able to use our data, is able to mine our data set for their applications and to serve it in general. Work with the BLM, Rapid Ecosystem Assessments, and a number of agencies and universities. We just released the new website on the 8th, which now has daily data along with monthly data, lots of new diagnostic plots. We've incorporated new data sets, and we're up to something like 430,000 files. This is just to give you an example of what we've done. The website over here on the left, this is an example of using HUCs. We have nested geographic areas. So in this example, we're going from HUC 2 down to HUC 8 in resolution. And for each one of those HUCs, you can now click on the website to get plots of the climatology for each one of those. So we're able to compare how our model simulates the observations, how it compares to the driving GCM. You can get time series, which is the same data, but now we're looking in time series for temperature and precipitation, same comparison, and then a whole series of scatter plots that give a nice idea of how well the model's matching the observations. And these are really meant to be guidance, so people aren't flying without enough information when they access our data sets. People need to know how good or how bad the model performs in the area of interest. We also have this for states and counties and ecoregions. We're working on adding the ecoregions. So the users can actually get a pretty good impression of how well the model is working before downloading our data and using it. This is just an example of the website where you can grab data by area, by variable, and by time and model, and it downloads a NetCDF file that goes right into any kind of application that uses NetCDF, including ArcGIS or any application. So the data actually flow completely into these applications along with metadata and all the information that's needed to use it. You can also get the data by FTP, and then the CETA website, you can actually upload shapefiles. Using their geodata portal, you can upload a shapefile like a cookie cutter and extract data and download that data to your laptop or to your desk site to use the data for other applications. So from these data, I put together this slide to kind of get at some of the things that we're interested in terms of the controls of salmonid life cycles. And across here, we're looking at different decades, so from 2029 to 2099 on the far right. This is for the A2 scenario. This is March snow water equivalent, May soil moisture, and July temperature max. And these are the changes relative to today. The cross-hatching is where these changes are statistically significant. We make a big effort to keep statistical significance in the picture. So what you can see is the transition here for loss of snowpack through all these time periods until we get out to 2090s and snowpack's lost. There's quite a large loss and significant loss everywhere. May soil moisture continues to decrease through the time, and July temperature over the time is also increasing. So these are the things that Jeff talked about earlier. These are the stressors climatic stressors that are going to come into play over the next decades. And in terms of disturbance, we're looking at wildfire. This is a composite of air temperature differences for high fire years in the west and low fire years in the west. So high fire years occur when temperatures are 1 to 2 degrees above what's normal. This is looking at these same time periods, 2029, 40, 60, and 80, through time for the bottom third of wildfires, the middle third, and the top third. And the message here is that the middle third is soon going to become more prevalent than the extreme or the high fire years that we observe now. And so the transition to the climatology will support wildfire and disturbances that will have a very big impact on streams and trout habitat is coming.
Okay, we're going to transition into some results from a couple of papers. So I'll be going back and forth between a paper that is coming out in December in Fisheries that is a retrospective analysis of all these subspecies. And so the data for part of this paper comes from that, and then there's a modeling paper that actually tries to associate what's going to happen in the future for some of these species. And we have data from some of those, not others at this point, but I'll go back and forth and talk a little bit about these. I'd be remiss if I didn't say what my colleague Clint Mulfeld says every time he sees this slide, which is the Transboundary Flathead is arguably the most intact ecosystem in the lower 48. And Clint opens every talk with that, and so I had to say it. I could not resist. But he's right. It's an amazingly beautiful system. Crosses the Canadian border. It's home of grizzly bears and west slope cutthroat and bull trout, and in large numbers. And as you can see there on the right, some fairly impressive sizes for bull trout that exist there. In the Transboundary Flathead, we have a number of issues that we'll talk about here that are consistent throughout this presentation as we go north to south. But what you're going to see from north to south is a gradual shrinking of habitat and constriction of habitat from north to south. And so some of the threats that are more significant here may not be as important, say, in Colorado or New Mexico, but there are other things there that operate that probably have much more of an influence on those populations. Of course, we've got glacier loss in Glacier National Park. Many of you have heard of this story before. Midwinter floods, again, this idea that we're getting snowpack and rain on snow events more frequently in this Transboundary Flathead area is cause for concern from the standpoint of that we have bull trout that also spawn in the fall, and so their eggs are in the gravel during this period of time. So a significant concern for us. The other issue up here is non-native trout invasions. We've had, and I'll talk a little bit about the stocking that occurred of rainbow trout in the Flathead River system. Of course, wildfires are a large issue in this part of the world, and we're starting to see more summer flow reductions and temperature increases as a result of some of the things that Steve said. I'm going to use a couple of terms in here, and I wanted to define it before I did. We're going to talk about spawning and rearing habitat, and those are in the blue lines that are up there on the map represented by the Flathead. And then the other term that we're going to talk about is foraging, migrating, and overwintering habitat. So one of the things that Clint and a group of us did is that we actually applied some of Steve's downscale climate models to temperature data that we had within the Flathead River Basin, both air temperature and stream temperature sensors. And as a result of that, when we looked at the 2059 simulation of the models that Steve put together, what we saw was about a 58% loss of this migratory and overwintering habitat that is throughout the Transboundary Flathead, and then about a 36% loss of the spawning and rearing habitat that's up there. And you can see where the temperature thresholds are exceeded by the red lines in the diagram. If we look at the 2099 simulation, our temperatures go up significantly. And again, we lose a lot more habitat within the Transboundary Flathead for bull trout, which are typically a very cold-tolerant species but don't tolerate warm temperatures very well. And so bull trout are probably the bellwether of salmonid that's most sensitive to temperature change in the group of fish that we studied. This was an interesting analysis that appears in this retrospective paper that I was talking about that's coming out in next month. And one of the things that Clint had data on was West Lobe cutthroat and hybridization that came from 1978. And along with the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Clint has been able to essentially keep a monitoring program in place over this time period that goes up to 2007. In fact, it goes until current time. And one of the things that we've seen is that as temperatures have increased, particularly in the lower Flathead River system, we're seeing more of these rainbow trout starting to invade upriver into the warmer temperature areas. So what Clint's seeing in this particular case is that hybridization is coming from these islands of rainbow trout, these propagules that live in the lower river, and they're spreading upstream, and essentially they're mating with the native cutthroat trout and creating these hybrids that are invading further and further upstream. So the warmer the temperatures are, it appears like the rainbow do better. We saw a very similar pattern of work that a graduate student and I did when I was at Utah State, looking at trout across the border in the Kootenai River system. There were these propagules that did very well, the rainbow trout, in warm water, and they were able to spread further and further upstream. So, again, this comes from some of Dan Isaac's work in the Boise River Basin. The Boise is an interesting place because it has native rainbow trout, and it also has bull trout. And what Dan did was to construct sort of a set of diagrams from the last, from 1970 on for air temperature, and the other was from 1945 in summer discharge. And what you see in these diagrams is air temperature in August is going up and has been since the 1970s, and we're seeing a decline in summer discharge. The other thing that's happening in the Boise throughout the West is that we're seeing large wildfires, and some of those are sizes that we haven't seen for probably 100 or more years, particularly the wildfires in '92 that were extremely large and have impacted a lot of the watershed. The interesting thing about all these changes taken together is that rainbow trout, which live in the lower portions of these watersheds, have now started to move upstream. And so when you look at the difference in habitat for rainbow trout versus where they were, say, 30 years ago and where they are now, there's really no net gain or loss because the rainbow trout essentially wouldn't occupy the cold headwaters, but now those headwaters are warming, and so they're moving upstream into those headwater areas. And they're occupying habitat that used to be bull trout stronghold habitat. And of course, what's happening with bull trout in this particular case is that bull trout are actually shrinking and occupying the headwater drainages, but not as prevalent in those the lower ends of these drainages. From a modeling standpoint, looking at bull trout across the Salmon River Basin, for example, you can look at the 2000 to 2011 numbers and then look to the right and see an increase of 2 degrees C, which is projected by 2099, creates a whole bunch of unsuitable habitat for bull trout. So we're going to see a pretty dramatic shift in suitable bull trout habitat over the next 100 years.
Okay. Another species that we've looked at a little further to the south is the Yellowstone cutthroat. This is a project that several of us have been working on, both Jay Alder and myself and Robert Alchokachi and some other colleagues at Norrock. This is the Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the Yellowstone region, and you can see the typical habitat there on the right. These are high elevation. A lot of these streams are quite small, but it's a pretty extensive range that's covered by the Yellowstone. The issues with the Yellowstone are pretty similar to the western cutthroat, with the exception of in much of its habitat, we have to deal with water withdrawal and irrigation. And this has become, or is actually, a very big issue in terms of providing enough flow and enough cold flow for the fish to begin with. So that's something that we're already dealing with. It's a stress on the system that's in place, and anything else that happens in terms of disturbance or climate changes on top of that. And there are two major river systems here, the Snake and the Yellowstone, that we're looking at. We put together a distributed regression model that uses something like 500,000 daily air temperature and 150,000 stream temperatures, and put together a distributed model over the habitat range of the Yellowstone cutthroat. And one of the things we did with this is reconstruct the 20th century May through September stream temperature anomalies, and this is relative to the 1980 to 1989 time period. And you can see that through the early part of the century, temperatures were quite a bit cooler. We had an uptick in the drought during the drought period of the 30s, somewhat more warming as we go on, but then in the 90s and the 2000s, there was a big jump. And this is all from observed data, so this is not modeled. These are actually what we're seeing in terms of temperature changes and stream temperature changes over the range of the Cutthroat already. We took the climate model and used output from the climate model to make stream temperature anomalies for the future. This is 2050 to 2059, 3 different climate models, but you can see that the anomalies are somewhere between 1 and greater than 3 degrees, all of them warmer, and all of them up in the range of that 1.5 to 2 degree where we start to see some real issues with the ability of the trout to adapt to it. In terms of hydrology, we can see that the snow water equivalent here in the upper Snake, in the blue is the control period, the red is the modeled period or the future period, so you see that there's an overall loss of snow water equivalent monthly throughout the season, and the runoff in the upper Snake changes. We actually have higher runoff early in the year, especially through May and June, and then a decrease, and then not much change in the summer. The Yellowstone shows a similar pattern, pretty much reduced SWE the whole, over all of the year actually, and then changes also related to early snowpack, melting, and early runoff, which again, as Jeff said, really has a big impact and influence on all the species that are spawning. So in terms of total growth potential, this map shows the changes in growth potential for the whole May through September period. You can see that at high elevations we've gained growth, and at lower elevations we've lost the growth potential, which has a lot to do with the temperature of the water. These are a few plots of the growth potential through the year. And for instance, in the Yellowstone, if you look at the upper Yellowstone, the cold water that is actually now too cold for the fish becomes warmer and actually much better for the fish, and so they actually gain quite a bit of growth at high elevation. At the low elevations, you can see that now there is a sag in the summer as warm temperatures inhibit growth, but under warmer climate conditions, there's much more of a sag. So what happens here is there's a trade-off between the high elevations and the low elevations, and overall, the Yellowstone cutthroat actually look to be in pretty good shape because there is actually potential habitat for them higher up that's basically undisturbed. There are competitions with the Yellowstone cutthroat and the rainbow trout, and from the work we did, we see that in some places the Yellowstones outgrow the rainbows, in other places the rainbows outgrow them. But then there's also the issue of hybridization and the connectivity. As we worry about connecting the streams or keeping them connected at lower elevations and mid-elevations, will that actually allow invasive the Yellowstone or the rainbow to invade further and hybrid with the cutthroat?
You'll notice as when we talk about the next two subspecies, that one of the issues as we keep going, and I mentioned it earlier, is that the current range for Colorado River cutthroat tends to be one of the overriding issues because they're limited in habitat already by things like fragmentation, water development, management, and the introduction invasive species. And so as we go further from north to south, you're going to see this issue of limited habitat become more and more of a question and more of a player as we go along. So this work was done with in cooperation with Colorado State University. James Roberts is the PhD student and now a Mendenhall. And he's working with Kurt Fausch and a number of us on this particular part. His prediction is that populations of lower latitudes and elevations and shorter stream fragments will be less likely to persist. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along here. What James did is he worked with another of our co-authors and to work on using a Bayesian network approach to predict Colorado River cutthroat trout persistence. And Doug Peterson works for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Doug has actually done a lot of this kind of modeling in a past life. And we'll talk a little bit about the the publication that's come out of some of Doug's work in just a second. But what they did is come up with some diagrams and their idea of how this process worked, looking at the idea of stream fragment length influence, population size, that there are stochastic effects from things like wildfire, floods, that are going to influence habitat potential and population persistence. And then overlaid on top of that is this idea of climate and changing maximum stream water temperatures, and then the warmest 30-day temperature throughout the year. The time horizon of their modeling was 2040 and 2080 in this particular piece. So what we see is that currently, if you look at the map on the right, that represents the range of Colorado River cutthroat trout. So you can look at Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, down into New Mexico, or excuse me, not New Mexico, but Wyoming and Utah and Colorado, and this represents the bulk of the range here. Right now, what we see is those populations are typically limited to the high headwaters of the mountains in those three states. So there isn't a lot of connectivity to large river systems for Colorado River cutthroat trout. So when we look at probability of persistence currently, we have populations that are doing pretty well, but those populations don't have the ability to move downstream, and so they're forced to deal with habitat at much higher elevations, and that habitat typically is much colder. And so currently that habitat limits their ability to move and grow because it's too cold. Well, as climate changes, it turns out that habitat is going to be more available because it's going to be warmer. So they have the opportunity to move upward. And of course, it's limited by how far they can move based on water and water availability. But by 2080, it looks like about 60% of the populations that are in this pool right now are going to be limited by the fragment size that's there and their ability to persist based on temperature. Even though they have the ability to move upwards, they really can't move anyplace else. We're going to talk a little bit about a project that James is working on that actually looks at the influence of lakes and these high elevation lakes as potential refugia and places where we can mitigate some of the effects from climate change. So the bottom line for Colorado River cutthroat trout is the risk from warming is low because they're already restricted to these high cold streams. And really the issue for them is small fragment size. They just don't have the ability to occupy larger and larger fragments like we saw in the Boise Basin, like we saw in the Flathead or Yellowstone. They just aren't connected to these large river systems. So if you think about conservation, one of the issues that we talk to managers about is how can we increase fragment length and make more habitat for these species downstream. And that involves a whole lot of management trade-offs that include getting rid of non-native species, putting in barriers downstream as part of restoration that are pretty intense and require a lot of effort and money. So one of the things that James wants to do as a consequence of this project is looking at, okay, if you expand the length of the fragments of stream that are involved, what's the risk of doing that? So are you better off keeping what you have from the standpoint of small populations and hoping that you're not going to have a stochastic risk of extinction, or do you just say, we're going to bite the bullet, we're going to extend the fragment lengths, but we might have an issue with non-native species or other things. So, the final species that subspecies we're going to talk about is the Rio Grande cutthroat trout. And the Rio Grande is very limited from the standpoint of its habitat. We're talking very small populations of Rio Grande cutthroat trout. We're talking warming water by the modeling that's being done, in disturbances that are more frequent, declining flows and water availability in that southern part of Colorado and northern Mexico, and again, this idea of small fragment sizes. This is just to give you an example of some of the work that Andrew Todd and his co-workers have been doing. One of the things that they've been looking at is this idea of climate and wildfire. And of course, what you saw from the graph that Steve presented is that climate has an influence on wildfire frequency. This Medano Creek fire in Colorado was a big fire. These fish are limited to small fragments within this watershed. The lower ends of the watershed are already too warm for Rio Grande cutthroat trout. If you look at the numbers from the Colorado Division of Parks and Wildlife in 2004, we were talking about 460 fish per mile. After the wildfire, we're down to 191 fish per mile. So small fragment size, declining populations, real risks for extinction here. At the same time, when you look at some of the data from the Colorado River and Rio Grande headwaters, the last 10 years have been extremely dry down there. Not a lot of water. Again, we have issues with irrigation withdrawals, municipalities, a lot of competing uses for water. Pretty tough place to be a cutthroat trout. So some of the take-home messages from this are that climate change is going to compound some of the existing stressors that are out there. There's no doubt about that as far as we're concerned. Again, the greatest risk is to some of these smaller, isolated peripheral populations that don't have the ability to move or escape things like wildfires by moving into other drainages. Managers really need to think about this restoration action in these high-risk, high-value habitats to increase resistance and resilience to climate change. And also, one of the things that we hear is that managers need to sort of understand sort of what all this is telling them, how they evaluate management actions in the face of climate uncertainty. One of the things that Doug Peterson's been doing in this manuscript, again, is coming out in the next issue, not this coming issue, but the next issue in Fisheries, has been looking at Bayesian belief networks and sort of developing networks of variables that sort of talk to the explicit nature of relationships between sort of climate, temperature, life history, and how that's going to influence the persistence of cutthroat trout. What's really interesting about this approach is that it allows managers to assign probabilities for each of these circles there and how they're going to influence the ultimate survival and the ultimate persistence of cutthroat. So in this example, you can look at the red up there represents habitat length of less than 5 kilometers, and then as you go successive colors down to the green, which is greater than 40 kilometers, then you can look at those and say, all right, with the modeling we've done, what's the persistence probability for fish within this watershed? And if you keep your eye on the green habitat as it goes along, you can see, okay, by the 2080s, this place, these green habitats that are up here, are probably the places where we're going to have the last remaining strongholds of cutthroat trout. So if you're a manager and you want to spend money and effort into trying to protect something, you want to focus your effort in the places where you're going to have the best chance of success over the long term. And that's what Doug's modeling has shown. We actually have this with competing species, different species, invasive species. So there's a whole host of things that Doug's done with this modeling. Just a little bit about some of the work that we've done. We've got 9 journal articles either accepted in press or published right now from this work. There are multiple articles that are in preparation or submitted. Steve and his students have 3 or 4. I know from our shop we've got another 2, and there are probably another 3 or 4 out there. We've got 3 open file reports. We've held 4 symposia in conjunction with professional societies, and we've got another one planned this spring in conjunction with the American Fisheries Society, where we've turned the whole climate dialogue back to the managers and said, we're going to let the managers run the workshop and give talks and tell us what they need. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's worked in a second. And then we've done, each of the subspecies has technical committees, and we've done workshops with these various technical committees to talk to them about what we've done with the climate change modeling and then how we use these decision support systems to help them come to some decisions. And I'll give you an example of that here right now, and those are 2 of the websites that we have. Steve talked about the climate modeling on his website there, and then if you need more information about the products, go to this on our website, and more of the products and where you can find them are there. So in 2011, Dan Isaac in the Forest Service, USGS, Trout Unlimited, and the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative pulled together a workshop where we brought in managers and did a 2-day download of sharing climate information, talking about analysis tools, discussing management implications for climate change. And it turned out to be a really nice workshop that's up on the website. It's got PowerPoint presentations, and you can go to the website and pull this stuff off and look at it. But it turned out to be a really successful workshop, and a lot of people showed up, brought data, talked about what's going to happen. It was a neat forum for discussing these ideas. So what's next? We have a couple of things that we wanted to share with you, and we'll talk about these and then wrap it up here. The first of these is called Norwest, which is a collaborative project with the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative, Trout Unlimited, us, a bunch of actors, bad actors up there. And one of the frustrations that we had as we were doing this modeling exercise is that there wasn't a lot of available temperature data all over the western U.S. that we could use to sort of validate the air temperature models that came from the downscale climate models. So as we thought more about it, we were all talking about this idea that it seemed like everybody and their brother was out using iButtons all over the landscape and these iButtons are digital temperature recorders and streams to figure out, locally what their temperatures were. Well, that turns out to be the data that's available from all of the sources that are out there. We've got 45 million hourly records, 45,000 summers, and all this is being collected by various agencies and NGOs and everybody out there. It's amazing how many people are collecting this kind of stuff. So the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative seeded some of this project, and it turns out that it's a $100,000 project cost, but this sensor network is probably worth millions of dollars because we now can develop models by subwatershed for each of these air temperature models that validate kind of what's going to happen with the predictions that we've made regarding water temperature. It's really going to help from the standpoint of more precise bioclimatic assessments for things like bull trout, risk analysis, those kinds of things. And the models by watershed are being completed as we speak. So for right now, with the Salmon River models being completed, we're working on the Clearwater, and we're going sort of subbasin by subbasin across the map that you saw up there. So a really neat project that spun off of this current project, but has been funded by a variety of other sources. One of the things that James has done, and I talked to you a little bit about this earlier, is in the Colorado River cutthroat trout in particular, there is a large network of mountain lakes. And these mountain lakes could potentially be real key refugia for Colorado River cutthroat trout. And so what James is doing with part of his Mendenhall is actually building a model to look at lakes and how important they're going to be for the conservation of Colorado River cutthroat trout. And it's really a key piece that we, in this particular case, is unique to Colorado River cutthroat for the most part. and this is kind of what we're talking about. It's kind of a visualization of this that James put together, but it's this idea that these lakes could represent areas where we have suitable habitat for cutthroat trout where they don't have to occupy just these high headwaters, and there are a number of them within the range of cutthroat trout that include the Uinta Mountains, Green Rivers, all the way up into Wyoming. So pretty interesting idea, and I think really worthwhile. This idea of long-term monitoring is really going to be key because we've made a lot of predictions. We've talked a lot about things like invasive species and influence and population response, but what we really don't have is a whole lot of data. And when we look for population response to what's going to happen out here from the standpoint of our predictions, we don't have a lot of good, consistent data everywhere. And these things are going to be really valuable from the standpoint of looking at whether or not we're right. And I'll give you a short example. We sort of predicted that during dry years that brook trout, in the modeling that we've done, are going to be able to take advantage of dry years because they're going to spawn early in the fall, they're going to be able to overwinter, and then they're going to be able to essentially raise their young and have a leg up on cutthroat trout before they ever get out of the gravel in the springtime. And this year, we went back to 3 different locations and have seen an expansion of brook trout populations in 3 different places that we've been monitoring. So that's an example of sort of a prediction of whether or not we're going to be able to use this data to say, okay, how can we anticipate what might happen, and can we provide that information in a timely fashion to managers so that they can use it to, sort of do initial attack sort of responses on population like this. So interesting stuff from the standpoint of, what can we do now to help managers with some of these issues. The other part of this is this idea of integrated watershed responses to climate change and disturbance. And we've talked a lot about what's going to happen in these watersheds with more wildfires, changing flows, and all the rest of it, but we really haven't spent a lot of time modeling what those things are going to do. We really haven't thought about that in the way, if we've got small populations, where those places are going to be potentially the big hits that these small populations might take. And then the other part to this is just the idea that we really need to improve the models that we've built because they're based on data that we had at the time, but more data, we're going to be able to build better models, and then we're going to be able to inform management decisions in probably a more timely fashion. One of our scientists came in about 3 months ago and said, one of the things that is an issue is that all you guys talk about is climate science for my great-great-grandchildren, but what about now? And we really have focused a lot on climate science and predictions for 50 years out or 100 years out. And we started thinking, well, okay, can we use some of the data we've collected for things that are much more real-time, like now? And Erin Towler, who's a postdoc with us at NCAR, did a really interesting exercise where she looked at flows in the Big Hole River in Montana where Arctic grayling are in the last sort of refuge population. And so the Big Hole Watershed Coalition is a group of managers, livestock growers, NGOs, and their goal is to protect Arctic grayling within the Big Hole, and temperature is a serious issue for Arctic grayling in the summertime. So what Erin did was she went to the coalition and said, well, what do you need to know? And they said, if you could tell us by May whether we're going to have a problem out here or not, then we can go to the producers, the livestock producers, and say, hey, by July, we're going to need a CFS or 2. And so what she did was said, all right, I'll use some of the information we have from this climate modeling exercise and see if I can't get a handle on what things we might be able to do to help. And what she found was that the May-June precip turns out to be one of the biggest things that you need to know if you're going to try to protect flows later in the year. And she built a simple model, took it to the Watershed Council, talked to them about it, and these guys are all over it. They really liked what she did. Pretty simple, but something that helps. One of the things that we're facing in the West all the time now is stream closures in the summertime. because we have high temperatures, streams close off. If our managers know early, then they can alert the public that these things might happen. So it's these kinds of things that we're interested in. And again, if you look at small populations like the Rio Grande, what are the influence when somebody puts in brown trout or rainbow trout in a place where we have a small population, and how can we assume whether how long are these populations going to persist? So, okay,
so this is the last of the stream of the modeling. We've come up with this idea that what we can do is actually do near-term stream temperature guidance in a probabilistic way. And the way we would do that would be to take our existing models that we've built of water temperature as a function of air temperature and perhaps flow where it's important. But there's lots of guidance. We can use our climate simulations, which are about 2 weeks behind real time. We have all the SNOTEL and flow forecasts from the NRCS. We have 6 to 10 day outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center on the probabilities of high or normal, high or low temperatures. And we have 7-day National Weather Service predictions of temperature. So we're working on a way to combine all of these in a probabilistic way so that we can do some kind of a near-term forecast, whether that's 10 days, 7 days, whatever, so that we can actually say something about what might happen in terms of the temperature of these rivers in the near-term future, so that people who are invested in recreation or whatever would have some kind of guidance to go through that process with us and be able to do something about it in terms of thinking about closures and where and how they may have to do it. This is just beginning. We're just beginning to do this. The great thing about it is we have a lot of historical data from all these sources, and we can test this thing rigorously to get an idea of how well it may work. We'll skip that one and go to questions.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. That was really interesting. Lots of great information and thoughts, and we really appreciate it. The plan is we've got a few folks here in the room, so we're going to take a few questions here, and then we're going to go to the phones and give those folks an opportunity to ask some questions. So first I'll just open it up here in the room and see if anyone has any questions. And Jeff and Steve, if you guys could repeat them if folks aren't near a microphone, because otherwise I don't think the folks will hear that. So Matt, or do you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
When you showed the data for the forest fire and the decline in trout populations from 460 to 191, and I can't remember what species it was, but do you also, when you model, do you look at recovery rates from that? Because obviously that's caused by, increased erosion, warming temperatures because of the buffer of trees is gone, things like that. But then you get a bump after a few years because the downed logs create better habitat as they congregate in the stream, and various other things happen. So how do you account for that in the models, that you're going to get a steep decline, but at the same time you're going to get a bump after a few years?
It's a real balancing act, because in the Rio Grande in particular, in that particular watershed, the fragment sizes are so small that you aren't able to take advantage of that bump that you're talking about in a way that you could in larger watersheds where there's more sediment production, more wood, those kinds of things, because you're isolating these fish in very small places. I worked in southern Utah in 3 different drainages where we had fragment sizes that were less than 3 kilometers long with fishing. At the end of 3 wildfires, our populations were next to 0. And so from the standpoint of the number of fish that are there and being able to take advantage of that bump that you're calling from the standpoint of, increased woody debris, sediment, and production that typically happens after wildfires, you have to have enough habitat to be able to, grow fish to be able to take advantage of it.
Okay.
So it's that dynamic between size of the fragments and then size of the disturbance. And so in this particular case, it'll be interesting to see whether the bump actually occurs, because that data is from 2011 that showed the decreased population size. Now, whether or not over the next few years we see an increase, that'll be an interesting question.
This is Matt Larson. Have you had any kind of interaction with the kind of elected officials or the sort of the far end of the continuum out in the areas of interest? I know that we have here in Washington. I'm just wondering how it's, if you had that out in your region.
Matt asked if we had any connection with elected officials regarding some of this work, and the answer to that is yes. We have had a lot of interest from Idaho and Congressman Simpson's office, and in particular, this workshop we're talking about in spring of next year, we've invited Congressman Simpson to be one of the speakers because he's shown an interest in this work and the utility of the work. One of the things that we talk about a lot about to the lay public is this idea of, you know, using this information for people to make decisions. Craig Matthews, who's an outfitter in Idaho, you know, he wrote an article, a popular article not too long ago, and he said, I've been living in Last Chance, Idaho, which is up near Yellowstone, for 30 years. He goes, anybody that doesn't believe climate change isn't real, come see me. And that gets legislators' attention because this guy's well respected throughout the state of Idaho. So, yeah, and Senator Tester's office in Montana has also been interested in this work. We got to present some of this to Senator Tester's staff and Senator Baucus' staff.
You know, just a quick follow-on. I think they can hear me. You don't have to repeat it. I think Simpson's interested in part because there's a big economic component. Do you happen to know any kind of ballpark numbers? What does trout fishing, recreational trout fishing, stimulate in the Idaho economy or anywhere else out there?
It's millions of dollars. If you add in not just the fishing part, but the mom-and-pop grocery stores, the gasoline that's bought, the lodging, it's worth millions and millions of dollars.
And you can see the impact of that when they close streams because the temperatures are too high for a week or 10 days. People plan their whole summers coming to fish, can't fish.
This is millions of dollars in spot locations, but
right.
Integrated, does anybody have a feel?
You know, it's really interesting. As an aside, we are planning an international trout congress for 2015. And one of the aspects that we're talking to some people about is this idea of what the socioeconomic sort of value, and particularly the economic values there are to community. And there are very few studies that talk to the idea of total value.
There's a good Mendenhall project for you there.
Take it.
All right, any other questions in the room? Okay, so Jake?
Yes, I'll stand here so people on the phone can hear. This is Jake Weltzine.
Hi, Jake.
So I have a question about the long-term monitoring, and what's really nice is you've got a very nice framework and show a strong need for the long-term monitoring data itself. You can just plug it straight into models, do data model fusion, et cetera. So my question kind of is a bit broader about the capacity that's out there to create a framework for long-term monitoring of the kind of information that you need. You talked about northwest. There should be maybe a southwest and a southeast, et cetera, I suppose. But think about kind of from a biological perspective. What's missing, or what would you need to be able to ensure the proper data are collected and then made available, say, 50 years from now?
There are a number of efforts out there at broad scales that integrate this kind of data. One that USGS is very familiar with is, our NAQUA program. That's a good example of how you consistently collect data, the kinds of data that you need to answer specific questions. There's the Pacific Northwest Aquatic Monitoring Partnership, which involves a bunch of agencies that have dealt with this particular issue of monitoring over broad scales. So there's lots of frameworks that exist that could be drawn upon if we could all agree on the sets of information that we would like to have. And a lot of this isn't easy. The population information and trying to get folks from individual states to collect data consistently across a broad scale is really a problem that I think we have. But it's one that if we could solve, we would have an immensely powerful data set.
Another issue is a lot of these data sets, for instance, the Yellowstone Cutthroat data set that we're using, it's quite difficult to collect it. You have, we have a postdoc doing it now, and a crew, a small crew, but they're going all over the place, putting in all these sensors in these headwater streams in pretty remote places, and it requires a lot of effort to keep that going. And what we found when we did our studies is some of these records are good for 2 or 3 years when there's some interest in it, and then they're gone. And so the challenge here is, as you say, is to come up with the kinds of data we need, but also come up with a system that will support that for long-term monitoring. And that's always a challenge with all data, regardless whether it's fish or water or geology or whatever it is. So
yeah, agency commitment is always the hardest thing to overcome. I've done 3 or 4 of these, and it's always the hardest thing to overcome.
Okay, so I'm going to get one more question, and we're going to go to the phone. So do you mind walking closer to the microphone? That would be great.
Yeah, Jim Hatton. Question about how will the changing climate shift the advantage to exotic species? Because it seems like in places like, well, all over, smallmouth bass are just going crazy, and there's many other exotic species, and it seems like that could be the greatest threat to these fish communities. What do you see can be done about something like that?
Again, it's an issue that we've thought about. In fact, we have a nascent proposal. In the Yellowstone River, they found smallmouth bass in about 100 miles downstream near the town of Billings. And with changing water temperatures and examples like the Grande River in Oregon, where smallmouth bass are everywhere, one of the things that we could do is really look at modeling we've done from a water temperature standpoint, where smallmouth bass are now, and sort of predict how fast they're going to move into the upper system. It's only a matter of time before somebody introduces northern pike or some other species in the Yellowstone River. And I had a call about a year ago from a guy who wanted my support in declaring walleye a native Montana species. And I said, no, I couldn't do that. But there are people out there that are interested in species and moving species around. And so, but for example, in the Yellowstone, it's just a matter of time. And I think it's going to be an issue much like it is everywhere.
So, Dave, I think that wraps it up here in the room. I'll turn it over to you to do the phone.
Okay, thank you, Emily. We right now just have one that's in the chat box, so I want to remind folks that are listening in, they can type questions into the chat box, and I can read them to the presenters. Or if you, down below the participants list, you'll see a bunch of icons, and if you just hit the little hand icon, that means you're raising your hand. I'll call on you, and you can then unmute your phone using *6 and ask your question yourself. But I'll take the one from the chat box first, from Susan Walker. Had a technical question about the ESHAM-5, wondering about the resolution for that. She thought it was 120 kilometers.
Yes, the native general circulation model run, the global model run that was done, is indeed several degrees in resolution. What we do is we use global models like that model to drive our regional models. So we're downscaling that from several degrees or a couple degrees to 15 kilometers. So we take the native resolution of whatever global model we're using and use that to make boundary conditions to drive our model.
Okay. Then Larry Zuckerman, you have your hand up. If you could hit *6 and unmute your phone. I can't see that.
I unmuted my phone. Okay. This isn't a question, it's just a couple of comments. I used to do Rio Grande Cutthroat trout restoration in southern Colorado. And just for clarification, Medano Creek is on the Great Sand Dunes National Park. And parts of it are on the National Forest, but that was a restoration project. And it doesn't really have anything to do with warming, but the lower end sinks into the sand, and it always has.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, we did have a restoration project right on near the New Mexico border way before anybody was talking about climate change, and somebody did stuck brown trout on top of it. So one thing you might want to watch in the different states that are listening is make sure there's a law that it's against the law to stock fish, because some states don't have such laws. And
yeah, and as you probably know, the restoration project on the Turner Ranch property is probably the largest for, at least in that part of the world.
Sure. And what we tried to do in the Great Sand Dunes was more than just cutthroat trout. We tried to also stick in the native Gila, the Rio Grande chub, and the native sucker, the Rio Grande sucker.
Right.
And it's nice to know the cutthroat is still there after quite a few years. One of the things I noticed that was a real problem, and it's an attitude problem, is separate from warming temperature is the rainbow trout and brown trout that serve the guest ranches on the main stem Rio Grande that could be totally suitable for cutthroat trout. People love the brown trout and rainbow trout, and they have no interest in getting rid of them.
No.
And so the Rio Grande cutthroat trout, at least when I was working on them, were always marginalized as non-game fish,
right,
and not part of the main fisheries program. And
yeah,
so it's more of a political management problem than just where is the habitat fragmented or not.
I agree. We see the same thing almost everywhere. When we talk to the Guides Association about native trout restoration, we talk about eradication of rainbow trout. Typical guide response is, those are our money fish. That's true. And they view rainbow trout, because they jump and fight harder in many cases, as if they can catch one big rainbow trout a day, they get a better tip. So we have some work to do regarding the whole native fish, wild trout sort of dynamic.
Thanks.
Okay, I have another question here coming through the chat box. Don't know who it's from. It's a two-part question. How is groundwater distribution and abundance incorporated into these models, and any indication of the rate at which shallow and deep groundwater will be affected, and at what rate?
Right now, these models implicitly take into some account groundwater just by the observation. So in other words, if we have temperature sensors that are sensing groundwater inputs, that comes into play. We do not have yet direct groundwater, surface water modeling and temperature modeling exchanges. That's a very complicated thing to do in terms of long river reaches. It can be done in relatively short reaches, but that definitely is one of the things that we're interested in looking into when we talk about total watershed response to disturbance and flow changes. Second part was how is groundwater and recharge likely to change in the future?
No, any indication of the rate at which shallow and deep groundwater will be affected?
Not in the research we do. I think there are people that do groundwater modeling that in the USGS that have a pretty good handle on some aquifers in places where they know better. We don't really have that kind of information.
Okay, and then another question from the chat box from Rick. From your perspective, what are the biggest impediments? Oops, somebody had another question and it went away from my chat box. Sorry. From your perspective, what are the biggest impediments to developing additional good decision support tools regarding western trout management?
That's a good question. I think part of it is that the tools that we've developed have been in conjunction with management, but we often don't do a good job of sitting down with the people that are going to use the tools and get a very clear understanding of their interest in those tools. So, for example, we can develop a great Bayesian belief network model that works pretty well, but if that's not what managers want, then we've probably wasted a lot of time. So I think we need to do a better job at the front end of getting input for building the kinds of models that managers will actually use rather than the things that we think that they should use.
And I would add to that, I think another component of this, that Jeff brought this up earlier, is there's definitely an economic aspect to this, and how much we can do these modeling exercises, and we can look at the potential for change, and we can look at the management interaction. But at some point, management decisions have to reflect the reality of the economic support to make the decision. So one of the things I think is really important is for us to get some perspective on, for instance, what Jeff was talking about. Do we go for it and we try to do what we can for populations that we think will be able to be sustainable for long term? Do we make investments other places? So there's a whole other aspect of this that's pretty complicated, I think, to bring into the equation, but needs to be brought in.
Okay, I have a comment here from Susan Walker, but before we do that, Emily, do you have any more questions from the room there that have cropped up?
No, I think we're good, so you can wrap it up on your end. I just have a last thing to say.
Okay, I have a comment from Susan Walker and a quick question from Stephen Hilliard. Susan's comment is, a note from Alaska. We face the same climate effects, glacier loss, midwinter floods due to rain on snow, increased fire frequency and intensity, summer flow reductions and temperature increases, and non-native species expansions, but not necessarily salmonids, northern pike. And these effects are exacerbated by the fastest effects of warming on the globe, with additions of melting permafrost and abiotic changes due to melting sea ice. So, in analysis, please do not forget about Alaska. We are in many ways in the forefront of this issue, effects of climate change on fish. And we may lack many of the complicating factors of anthropomorphic complicating factors, such as land use and water use.
Can I just say amen to that?
Yeah, me too. I agree. We haven't forgotten.
Sounds good. Oh, wait, here's more from Susan. In addition, the state is currently planning a very large dam on a pristine river that is likely to exacerbate some climate change effects. The climate change effects on the Susitna River. National Marine Fisheries Service has proposed a comprehensive climate change study for this project. That's it. And then just another comment here. The web address was not visible at the bottom of the screen for information products on your slide there. Information on climate and effects on native trout project. Could you please spell out the web address for the listeners?
Certainly. It's http://nrmsc.usgs.gov/climate_trout. And I can repeat that.
We will also be sending out the video in about a week, and I will include those two websites on the email to all of the attendees.
Thank you for doing that. And then Susan was just asking if we have a list of references cited in this presentation.
On the website, the papers that we refer to are all on the website.
Oh, great. That's a nice
and
resource.
Like I said, there are 3 of those papers that are due out within the next month. So, according to the publishers. In fact, we're working on the galleys right now.
Okay, Emily, I've just, there are no more, Steve Hillier says thanks, and but I don't see any more hands raised on the, from the telephone participants, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, we have one last question, and then I'll wrap it up. So, Laura, take it away.
I was just going to ask if you all had mentioned several times about hybridization between the different species, and how did you go about have you documented this, or is it mainly just the phenotypes become kind of mixed, or did you actually use genetic information to look at that, or?
Both.
Okay.
So the hybridization work that Clint's done has both a phenotypic component to it and a genotypic component.
Okay.
In fact, if you go to the website, there's a paper that Clint was involved with a geneticist that is really interesting as far as being able to use genetics to predict where hybridization might occur.
Great, great.
Well, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, big, huge thank you to Jeff and Steve. This was a super presentation, lots of great information, and it was great to hear all the questions. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today and NCTC for your assistance. This concludes our Fall 2012 webinar series, but we're going to be starting it up in the spring, so keep an eye out, and we hope to have you attending some of those. So thanks again, and have a great day, guys.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you, everyone.